think the recording started. So the how that was understood was ultimately shaped a lot by Sunstein's writing in like the 90s, end of the 90s and early 2000s about the echo chambers. And I think what's an important point here, I mean, we all know the echo chamber, right? But I think an important point with the echo chamber is that that idea was also ultimately very much shaped by the Habermasian tradition, by the idea that like, yes, like I buy into the idea that we need to come together, and when we come together, we engage in critical rational deliberation. But the problem, so there was never a critique of that idea, that fundamental assumption. But what was the critique was the idea that we would come together as diverse groups, because internet enables also us to come together with people that we already agree with, which is more comfortable, and that undermines the kind of Habermasian idea. So this was very much kind of a Habermasian argument ultimately. And so the idea became that like, okay, so if we deliberate in homogeneous groups, we only get arguments from one side, and it leads to a kind of divergence in opinions. We get more and more extreme opinions. And so there's a kind of feedback loop between isolation and extremism that's assumed this there. And not everyone bought into this idea, but it's been the kind of the framework of debate for a long time between the kind of public sphere and the echo chamber. So thinking of this a bit broader than just being in the sense of just okay.
And maybe minimize
the thing. All right.
Thanks.
I love this touch view thing. It's great. So better. So we can think of it rather than just thinking of it as a specific hypothesis or a theory. We can talk about a kind of paradigm of research, because there's obviously not everyone is agreeing about things, but a paradigm is defined by that there's some underlying assumptions, some underlying theories that we're all assuming that we're not seeing, that we're rarely debating, that we're rarely like making explicit. And so the overall tendency in the field has been this idea that there's a kind of feedback loop between isolation and radicalization. And this, I think, very interestingly, casts politics as ultimately consisting of opinions and arguments, right? There's a kind of rationalistic idea, what's been referred to as the kind of folk theory of politics, underlying what politics consists of. And polarization is therefore also highlighted as the kind of divergence in terms of opinions, so what's been called issue-based polarization. And so the kind of theories that I've already mentioned, the kind of the Habermasian, I think to be fair, if there's any sociologists in the room or anyone who likes Habermas, if you actually read Habermas, you're not going to really recognize him in how he's being referenced and understood in this literature, because he has a much more richer understanding of the social. But, you know, he is the kind of seen as the kind of the person that people lean on in this field. And then we have kind of Sunstein and the echo chamber literature. So I think what's really central here is what this assumptions of this field does to the object of study. Because if we assume that deliberation and interaction will naturally be critical rational, that whenever we interact with each other, we will tend to go towards a critical rational deliberation, and that when we have homogeneity, that leads to divergence, and we have heterogeneity, it leads to moderation. I mean, we can ignore the kind of content of interaction, right? And we can focus on the structure of interaction. So this assumption, which is, I think, always the case in paradigms, it fits with a certain method, a certain perspective. So basically, we can say that network cohesion and social cohesion are basically the same thing. And so that allows us assumption. And we can see this in a lot of papers where they're like, oh, this platform is polarized. So basically, they look at a network and they see something like this on a platform, and they're like, oh, it's a polarized platform, where they're meaning both network polarized and socially polarized. And they look at something like this and it's like, oh, it's cohesive, it's not polarized, there's no echo chambers. So this has been, I mean, of course, not every paper has been like as well described by this, but it's a general kind of tendency, I would say, in the field. So what are some problems, some limitations with this approach? Because we're seeing a growing kind of destabilization of this and a growing kind of critique of this way of studying social media. So one thing is the type of data that it's just been a long range of studies where people look at a specific platform, specific case in a specific country, often Twitter, and then grab some hashtags, look at the structure of the hashtags, and then they say, Either you do retweet networks and they're like, find that it's polarized, or they do mention network and find that it's not polarized. They write a paper and they say social media is not polarized, or social media is polarized. So it's a single country, single case study. And as a result, there's conflicting studies whether there are echo chambers or not. And like there's a growing sense that this is maybe not a very useful exercise. And the methodological kind of limitation I've already mentioned is that it's making a lot of assumptions about what the content of interaction is, and just focusing on the structure interaction. And so there's also this kind of sense, if you're more sociologically inclined, that it has a very narrow, limited understanding of what politics is. The idea that it's just consisting of opinions and arguments, that it's not more emotional and rich than that in this kind of sociological terms. And so there's a growing sense from people like Axel Bruns that this is an intellectual cul-de-sac and that we need some kind of new paradigm. So that's what we're gonna. I have a half an hour to develop a new paradigm, so that's going to be great. I'll bring up some different studies and ways that I've been approaching this. So first has been a project for a while where I'm looking at what constitutes a kind of the most unquestionably echo chambery place on the internet. So this is Stormfront, which is a very fringe online space that's been responsible for or linked to a lot of the kind of far-right terrorist attacks and murders over the last 20 years. It's an interesting space because it's been around for so long. So like the background story, it was founded by this guy, Don Black. He was like a former Grand Dragon of the KKK in Alabama. And I just have to tell you the background story because it's such a good story. So this is he's on a boat called Manana. This photograph is probably taken by like the FBI because he and his buddies here had the plan of invading the island of Dominica, which was a black-led island, a black majority island. And so his Nazi friends and him were going to overthrow the government and instate a neo-Nazi kind of government to create kind of a safe haven for the KKK where they could make their own law. So they had like the boat was full of like automatic rifles and everything. But it turns out that it's actually illegal in the US to invade other countries as a private person. If you're the government, it's fine. But they actually have a law against it, which is like, I wonder how the background of that law, like what happened. But I guess it was something like this. But so Don Black ended up in prison in the early 90s. And then in prison, he was was learning about this new thing called the internet. And he was like, hey, maybe this is actually an easier way rather than invading an island to create my own kind of space, own safe space for Nazis. So he learned programming as like a kind of evening course in prison. And he set up Stormfront, which was in some ways much more successful than his island invasion adventures. But so I've been studying, so I scraped the entire forum, and it's kind of a unique forum because it's like they haven't really updated their software since '95, so it's not amazing. But so the discussions have been ongoing since then. So so I have it's over 20 years of discussion continuously. You can trace users and how they changed over time. So this is precisely kind of what I focus on. So I've recently published a book on this and using kind of natural language processing with this kind of intention of understanding what actually takes place in this community and is it an echo chamber? Is it this kind of rational exchange of arguments that we're seeing? And so it's referred to the book as called the Intimate Communities of Hate. But basically, to make the story short, I'm looking at, for instance, how users, their language, how different it is from the community language, and then tracing them over time as they interact with the community, and then you can kind of see them converging with the language of the forum, and then studying different aspects of what is the changing in their language, how are they affected by interacting with the community. And you can see things like that they go from referring to themselves as I to referring to themselves as we or SF. They pick up internal words, and you can see the various types of changes in their language that shows that it's not rational exchange going on. it is much more of a kind of emotional identity-based shift, and that in a lot of ways the community is better understood as kind of a talk therapy group for insecure white supremacists that allows them to process like difficult things in their life that they don't understand and create a kind of narrative that situates them in a community. So it allows a much more kind of, it's a much more understanding of echo chambers that is much more based in kind of identity and emotions and so on. The kind of theorists that we end up drawing on in this book, so I should say I wrote this book is together with Anton Törnby, same difficult surname because he's my brother. Yeah.
I was just curious, so everybody's anonymous on that forum, I guess?
Yeah.
And how big was the community?
So it's in some terms it's not huge. So it's like maybe 500,000 active users. And the number of posts is in the tens of millions. So it's not compared to Facebook, it's tiny. But mostly that these are very active and very like most of the kind of murders, far right terrorist attacks and murders of the last 20 years have been linked to the forum. So it's a small click, but it's a active click.
Is it possible to see sort of a grid, to sort of be able to describe the center opinion and then see how this center opinion drifts in these 20 or 25 years, or isn't it really possible?
Yeah, so it's a bit harder because it's kind of drift in relation to what? You need to have some kind of fixed spot to, and I was thinking about this as well, of kind of like trying to trace the community like relative to the New York Times, but then you end up being like, okay, so maybe it's the New York Times that changed. And also they kind of focus on different aspects. So I didn't really manage to get there in some ways. So I focused more on kind of individuals' relation to the community and so on. But also looked quite a bit at how different events affected the community. And so, for instance, the election of Obama in 2008, how did that like change what they view as their out group? So kind of like word embedding and like before and after the election, what is the focus and so on. So I did manage to get to some of those aspects, but it would be really amazing to see the kind of the movement of the community over time for sure. But yeah, so we end up, because this is a kind of sociological book, and yeah. How isolated, I missed it. Oh wait, I can click here. How isolated are they from the others? From the others. I'm not sure. How isolated is whom from whom?
Sorry, I'm here. I just interested in because you said that the paradox with isolation lead to the feedback between isolation and radicalization. So I just wonder how connected they are. So this click of, or you call it cyber, how connected they are to the other part of the social network, or they just form a click and without any outgoing and incoming interaction. This is my question.
Right. So it's basically how isolated is the community from everyone else. So I think it's an important point. I'll get to this more, but it doesn't seem like this idea that they would not be aware of counter arguments or other ideas that are existing on the internet. It's just I find no evidence of this. It's just that's not what's going on. It's like they are very much they even engaged with it, and they also have the kind of they invite people who disagree to come argue with them. Which is like obviously not an amazing experience to like join the Nazi community and have like a lot of Nazis yelling at you, but you're very welcome to. They're like, yeah, but so it's not a good, like, this is also something I think that is an important point, that it's not that they're like unaware of opposing arguments, because it's not a rational process in the first place, and so we end up drawing much more on kind of instead of these critical rational deliberation ideas on Emile Durkheim and Randall Collins, they have a notion of kind of rituals as being the foundations of society and this kind of idea. So much more kind of understanding that emphasizes the emergence of community and tribes and so on. So this is the book. It's available open access on LibGen. because I couldn't afford the open access, but it's you can pirate it. You have my permission. Don't tell the publisher. Um, so that's the first kind of part of this, is like this looking inside of the echo chamber. But this is it's kind of a unique community, thank God. Yeah.
So if you look at the Stormfront community with the old paradigm lens and all, would you look at it as a polarized thing? Because I'm assuming that actually internally they're very homogeneous block.
Yeah. No, for sure. So this is like very much the idea of looking inside a specific echo chamber, and the idea here would be, and I think this is a great point, right? Because it would be like if you would look, it would be kind of a fairly homogeneous network, or actually the splits in the network are mostly like the Dutch community, the Australian community, and so on, like, because we looked at the network. But that would be like the idea would rather be that this is a separate community, separate from other communities on the internet, right? And I think that this is an important point, that there's both kind of within community echo chambers and between community echo chambers, which is like been wholly like kind of, because it's very hard to look at how much interaction there is between them, right? So it does come in with the kind of assumption that this space is somehow echo chambery as a whole. But yeah, so luckily most social media platforms are not Stormfront, right? Like there's things like Twitter and TikTok and so on that are more kind of mainstream, and that are more kind of that contain various kind of different opinions and communities within them. And also I kind of ended up doing the same thing I was just like complaining about, which is looking at a specific case, a specific platform. So the next step, I think, is to try to go beyond that and look at other social media platforms. I see a hand here. Do you have a?
Yeah, I still have a question, because in my naive understanding, if they are completely isolated, then how they can recruit new people? How other people know how to join them or something? So there need to be minimally some interaction,
Yeah,
incoming and
no, for
outgoing,
sure.
something like that.
I don't think, I'm not arguing that they're completely isolated. I'm arguing against entirely that they're isolated. So I'm with you. And it's also, I mean, it's a well-known community. I think it's also kind of interesting. Like I didn't say so much about it because I don't want to, but we look at kind of over time when people are joining the community, and find that events like the Obama election, there's like a 50,000 times higher number of people than average joining the day after the election of Obama in 2008. It's just like, if you look at the graph, it's kind of like, woo, and during the Obama years. So it is kind of, you can see how, and like we look at those users and see how they're like emotionally feeling after, and how they're processing their feelings. So this is how we looked at the kind of emotional processing dimensions.
Curiosity, maybe you were working something out. What happened last US election?
So I haven't, I'm so fed up with this community now. So I'm never writing it. Like, after writing a book, and like, the book isn't even that thick, but I'm so tired with this community. It's gonna find some different Nazis now to look at. Yeah.
Like a different level of the polarizations within that quite homogeneous communities, but in some particular issues, like the level of polarization is higher than like some other issues.
Yeah, I mean, so there are kind of splits inside of so it depends on what you mean by polarization, because you can speak of polarization kind of between different parts of the community, or you can think about them being just more crazy. Yeah. So I mean, what's kind of, this community is a little bit particular in the Nazi context, especially following kind of 2001, because Nazism kind of has moved towards focusing on Islamophobia rather than the Jews, and this is an old school Nazi community. So it's like their foundation is kind of it's they're against the Jews primarily, and they view Black people as kind of like, they're used like Obama, like the entire story that they came up with to understand Obama, because we could see people coming in and being kind of like feeling anxious about their identities and their roles in society, because a lot of their identities were implicitly built in kind of white supremacy and the notion that they were superior to Black people. And then like Obama comes up, he's like well articulate, obviously smarter than they are, and they're kind of like they have this kind of identity crisis. And then the stories that they use to process that and that they over time kind of arrive at is this notion that actually Obama is just a puppet for the Jews. It's like Rahm Emanuel and like the Jewish elite are the ones really in power, and that somehow provides like a comfort to them. And so that's kind of the core of the community, is this very old school Nazism. But obviously we've seen this kind of shift towards Islamophobia and kind of so Islamic, anti-Islamic racism over the last 20 years, especially. And so that's been a kind of growing tension in the community. And so you can see people like, so for instance, Anders Behring Breivik, the 2011 terrorist, Norwegian terrorist, he joins the community and he's kind of part of it, but they're all kind of aware that he's like a different strand of Nazi. And so there, he's like, yeah, I know you guys are not really with me on this, but I think you also need to consider like the Arabic, like the Islam threat and so on. And so that's kind of central tension in the community. But they're fairly civil about it. So it's not so polarized in this sense.
A question about like the centroid opinion, right? So, and you correctly said, like, well, where do we have to compare? What do we have to compare with? But can you see actually over time what if there is a change in the content or the central opinion in that group?
I mean, you can see, but it is quite tricky again, because it's kind of like, you can compare early later, but it becomes a lot of kind of focus on events and stuff. So something happens and then end up discussing it. And it's kind of, it doesn't necessarily capture the core of their opinions in some ways. I think now with large language models, you could kind of probably get further with it. But
I was just wondering whether like the language use is more extreme now than.
So I think it's an important point to mention that it's not necessarily that their language is that extreme, because they have kind of strict moderation rules. And so in terms of like, if you would mention like measure toxicity on the community, would be very low. Like it would be like the most civil community you've ever seen. Because they're like, oh, it's important that we seem nice, that we're well presented, so people will feel invited to the community. And so it's a lot of like that they don't use, like the N-word, you don't see ever, like it's forbidden on the community. And so instead they end up drawing on kind of academic Nazism from way back, like eugenic ideas. And so they use like groids to refer to. So that's both to kind of show that like, oh, we're very serious people, we're very serious Nazis. But also to have like a kind of we argue that it's part of like building this kind of internal language to show your competence in your kind of linguistic capital in the community. So yeah, it's remarkably civil. And if you look only superficially and not at what they're actually saying, which is like we should nuke Africa because like it's completely insane ideas, but just formulated in a polite way. Which is harder to measure somehow. So let's move to more toxic spaces and look at Twitter and stuff instead. So mainstream social media. And so so this is kind of very much ongoing work that I've been working on in the last 2 weeks or so. So I wanted to move beyond the kind of limitations of just one platform and one country focus. And so what I did is I collected all the political parties in the world linked to detailed statistical data from stuff like VDEM or Manifesto Database and so on. So we have a lot of kind of information about the parties and the countries. And so it ends up being 2,288 political parties in 209 countries. And I get all their posts on all the social media platforms that at least 2% of the parties are active on, which ends up being Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. Happy to talk a lot about my suffering and horror in trying to scrape all these platforms, but I'm not going to bore you with it unless you ask me. It's quite a lot of data. I had to buy like an extension to fit it. So it's all the videos. So I didn't download the YouTube video because it just didn't fit. But I downloaded all the Instagram videos, all the TikTok videos. I ran all of it through Whisper, so I extracted all the text from them. I also have all the comments on these posts. And so this is over the last 2 years, because before that it gets, as you can imagine, fussier and fussier with which parties are in power and so on, and it gets messy. And so, yeah, so I used both APIs, Selenium, various, or scraping Facebook. Don't ever scrape Facebook. It's so miserable. I literally had to like print screen an OCR to get parts of the text because they really don't want you to scrape them. Anyway, so how do I analyze this? So a lot of my focus has been on using large language models in the last 2 years. As everyone else, I'm very unique. And so this, I think, is very interesting because it allows the kind of, what we were just talking about, how it's difficult to get into the kind of the meaning. We've just been looking at kind of superficial aspects of language often, but to actually get into the content and the semantical aspects of the language. And so I use LLMs to analyze it. I use a kind of explorative pluralist approach to it, follow best practices that I came up with myself in the previous paper. So, yeah, basically try to explore this. And so what I want to know is basically, I want to engage with this question: are there echo chambers or not on social media platforms? And how do we better understand the content of interaction? So the first part is just like basically going through all of the comments, all the tens of millions of comments on these posts, and classifying whether the people commenting are supporters or detractors of the party, because this is the kind of the core of the echo chamber idea. And then also unknown, because we also always need an unknown category, right? But luckily, quite few of the posts or commenters are unknown. It's like 13.7, and it's usually like crypto spam. So it's and so what's the expectation here? Well, so if it's echo chambers, we would expect there to be very few detractors, right? We would expect a lot of the conversations to be dominated by supporters. So let's see. This is quite interesting, right? Because actually what we find is that majority of people engaging with the community are detractors. So there's less agreement than disagreement. We also see quite large differences. So look at Twitter here. We can conclude that Twitter is not an echo chamber, or it's an inverted. Not really, right? But I also wouldn't say that necessarily matters to some degree, because the entire echo chamber argument, like if you engage with the community and like everyone is disagreeing with you, it's not going to be an echo chamber, even if it's bots or not. But sure, I mean, it might be that Twitter is dominated by more bots than others. But I would usually, my perspective is that like it doesn't necessarily matter if it's bots or not, because it still shapes our experience of using the community or engaging with the community. Yeah, so this is last 2 years. Yeah, but I refuse. I follow Wikipedia. Wikipedia has like we refuse to call it X. So I go by their guidelines. But yeah, so Twitter. But yeah, so I think and we see some variance over time here. So like the Instagram is like the most echo chambery platform with 58.8%. But I think a kind of a good point here would be that like, okay, so this is the averages, right? And we're not supposed to look at averages because maybe half of them are fully supporter echo chambers and the other half are detractors. So it's better to look at like the fraction of conversations that are echo chambery, which I define as like, okay, it needs to be at least 5 messages and maximum and less than 10% detractors, then it's an echo chamber. And then there's like Twitter's like 0.8%. It's not a lot. And we see even like YouTube is a factor. So interestingly, like YouTube is more than Instagram here. Not significantly so, but 8.4%. So I mean, it's very few, and it seems like this entire echo chamber thing is maybe not what's playing out. So can we conclude from here that yeah, so focus here is social media is public sphere. Habermas was right. This is actually is great. There's no problem. You can all go home. So I would say that, like, as I kind of implied, I think we also need to actually look and engage with the content of interaction. Like, can't just assume there's a critical, rational conversation going on. We need to actually look at what the conversations consist of. And like Habermas and so on provides us actually with a quite strict definition of what is a rational deliberation. There's criteria that it needs to fulfill. So I started by having a kind of manual analysis of a sample of these conversations and trying to like classify them, understand what's going on. And again, I mean,
sorry, Peter, can I ask something? Can I interrupt in a
yes,
second?
go for it.
Yeah, thank you very much. About what you showed before, so I was wondering whether you also collect information like demographic information on the politicians, for instance, whether they belong to the majority or the opposition, and other stuff like also the gender, because this could kind of give you interesting heterogeneity analysis for the figures you show on echo chambers.
So I probably didn't hear. Sorry, I can't increase the volume for some reason. But whether I collected demographic and more information about the politicians. So these are actually the parties, the party posts. So I have another database where I have all of the parliamentarians as individuals on Twitter over 5-6 years. But it's really miserable to maintain that database because they keep changing parties, and every election is like, oh no, like I have to like make a new list of like 500 French people like in parliament. Like, so, and in that database, I do have more information about them as individuals, and I have some papers coming out on like, you know, like the age and gender of politicians, if that shapes how likely they are to spread misinformation on Twitter, and so on. So I've done some work on that, but this database only looks at the parties and the conversation in relation to the parties, because collecting all the politicians in the world, I need more interns, like, a lot of them. So yeah.
Thanks.
But yeah, so looking at yeah, I mean, so they're looking at the conversations. I again don't really find, so of course I'm kind of coming in inspired by the Stormfront book that I just finished writing, and I do find that it's very much looking at the interaction between supporters. It's very much the same kind of positive emotional community building, norm forming, boundary drawing, and looking at the interaction across political opponents. It's again like rational deliberation is just like not very dominant in terms of. Hopefully you can't read this because it's just horrible things. But it's rather something that I would refer to as coming from the kind of group identity, social identity paradigm would seems to me as outgroup derogation. So kind of conflictual interaction between groups that allow us to show solidarity with our in-group. So attacking the outgroup to show that we're part of the in-group. And so this is, again, like the social identity paradigm provides us with kind of explicit descriptions of these things, right? Like we have definitions. And so drawing on both the kind of manual analysis and on the theories from the kind of critical rational deliberation paradigm and from the social identity paradigm, I kind of define 3 categories and the other category that we always should have. So in-group favoritism, out-group derogation, and rational deliberation. And I provide I basically go through the entire material and code all of the comments based on which of these they fit into. And again, the kind of other category, it's fairly few messages that fall into that. And in terms of validation and so on, it does seem to work quite well. So what's the expectation here? So basically, we already found out there's not an echo chamber. So if it's a public sphere, which we should now have to expect, we should expect rational deliberation to dominate. So let's see what dominates. So what we see that rational deliberation is overall about 13.6%. And it varies again across platforms, with Facebook being highest. Twitter is also fairly high, which might make sense since there is more interaction across the partisan divide. But we also see that the in-group favoritism, which we also supposed to kind of expect on Twitter, since there's a lot of interaction between groups, is fairly low. So it seems like it's not a very nice place. There's a lot of like kind of outgroup derogation going on. But we also see variances across places. And looking at kind of separating between detractors and supporters, we kind of see what we expect, that when detractors, there's an interaction between detractors. There's 87% is outgroup derogation, whereas with the in-group favoritism among supporters is 86.4, which makes sense, right? So basically, across the partisan divide, there is very toxic interaction. And we can look geographically because we have 208 countries. So how much rational deliberation there is in different countries. Lowest rational deliberation is Namibia, Albania, and Syria are one of those places, which kind of makes intuitive sense to some degree. Highest amount of rational deliberation, Norway, Denmark, Japan, and New Zealand, which makes sense. But also Hong Kong and Russia, probably for different reasons. So and we can also look more because there's this kind of separation between in-group favoritism and out-group derogation. Because here it seems like the US is kind of a nice place to be, but actually it's so we see that it's very heavily dominated by out-group derogation. And so whereas Brazil, for instance, is it's not a lot of rational deliberation going on, but it's mostly in-group favoritism. So it's at least like people saying nice things to their friends, which is nice. You know, I think it's nicer. And yeah, so we can see that there's huge variance across geographical contexts. So I'm just going to mention this quickly because it's really ongoing, but because obviously just looking at the amount of rational deliberation and so on, it's not very, it doesn't go all the way. So I also ran Perspective API. So they have this new, they recently launched like measurements to not look at only toxicity, but also different aspects of rational deliberation and how like the kind of positive aspects of the public sphere. So like how much do people take others' arguments into account and so on. So I measured all of those aspects to also write a paper. And this allows a much more kind of fine-grained view. And because, I mean, obviously the strength of this database is also to do kind of comparative studies looking at the predictors. I just started doing a little bit of this, so it's very kind of last night on the flight kind of graph. But so this is looking at the VDEM country level polarization and how it explains the level of toxicity and on different platforms. I think what's interesting with this graph is, yeah.
So find differences between the platforms. So is this because, do you know whether that is because there are different people going to the different platforms? Or is there something about the platforms, the institutions of the platforms that makes this so?
That will have to be a future model, right? Because I think it's likely to be both. I think the algorithms of the platforms play a huge role, right? Like certain platforms really incentivize because they might maximize on engagement, and then that creates very toxic, you know, because if you write the most upsetting things, they go to the top, and so people are incentivized to write outrageous things. But there's also kind of probably a selection effect. There's also very different cultures on platforms in different countries, and I think that this is like something that I think. Like this is my entire point, looking across platform and looking across countries. We can't just be like social media does this, or like we can't even say that YouTube is like this, because YouTube is a different platform in Brazil than it is in Sweden. At least I think so. And that's also something this is part of this kind of what we see here is actually that there's an interaction effect between the country level polarization and the platform, where the toxicity varies differently as a function of the level of toxicity or level of polarization in the country, depending on which platform it is, which I think is a super interesting kind of point, right? Yeah, so this is it's a multi-level model with random input.
For these 209 countries, they fit in this model per platform, or this is a theoretical model.
Yeah, so this is it's a multi-level model with random intercepts for platforms and countries. So it's just looking at, so this comes from the country level polarization. So this is like putting all the parties in, looking at the average level of toxicity and their comments on the different platforms, and then seeing how this varies depending on the country level polarization. So because VDEM has a lot, like they have like thousands of variables. And so, yeah, just another thing that I looked at, for instance, just to give an example, is like liberal democracy, because so we see that actually the more liberal democracy a country is, the higher level of toxicity, which is quite interesting.
Well, isn't that just
Yeah, I mean, it's
suppression or?
probably, but and I think that probably this is the time not to use linear models, right?
Yeah.
Because I just said that, right? Like that Norway, but I think there's an interesting kind of effect there. Probably, if we look at, make a cutoff point at 0.5, we would get different curves which I think is interesting to do. But yeah, this is very much ongoing stuff. So there's a lot of potential to look at different aspects of what determines the level of toxicity and conflict. And so on.
I think I missed this, but how do you define toxicity?
So I use the kind of standard perspective API. So it's very well established. I'm not saying it's good, but everyone uses it. So I leave it there. So I measured, it's kind of an established way that Google provides for measuring the level of toxicity in comments.
It's not disagreement, but
So it's defined as something like how basically it captures incivility quite well. So like so Stormfront would be kind of, oh, this is civil, but yeah. So it's kind of measures the level of outgroup derogation. But so basically, I think what we can kind of arrive at, or that,
I think that the difference across the platforms can also be due to the type of content that, I mean, for instance, YouTube is mostly used for videos, while Twitter can be the short, text. And can that make a difference in the way these interactions happen?
I mean, probably all kinds of things matter, right? Like I think that the platforms, what I think that we need to get towards is this type of understanding. It's kind of like what affordances of the platform shape which type of behavior. Like I think that's what we need to move towards, instead of being like social media is polarizing. Like we need to be like, okay, under these conditions, this affordance does this with specific country context, which is kind of like the point here as well, like that we see interaction between the platforms and the level of polarization in the country, that shapes certain level of toxicity. And so it implies a kind of, we need to not just like broadly talk about what platforms do, but like in specific context, because as I'll get to, like the same type of interaction can be polarizing or it can be depolarizing. It depends on the social and political context. And we need to have a little bit more nuanced understanding. And I completely agree that, like, I mean, I'm very much, all of this comes from a kind of McLuhan Postman understanding of what media is. Like it shapes a certain type of language, and the language shapes a certain type of politics. And so certain types of politics work well on certain platforms. So like, and this is why we should be looking at media in the first place, to kind of understand how it shapes our politics and our social world. But I think like, basically what I come out with from this is that like when we like the existing paradigm, when it's looked at like interaction across the political divides, it's kind of imagined that it's going to look like this, right? That this is the kind of Habermasian idea of what interaction between political opponents look like. And instead, like what I think that this looks like is more like this, that it's, I really wonder who sells this t-shirt. But that it's contentious, conflictual, and that like it is highly aggressive. It's not a kind of rational deliberation that causes us to moderate. And this is also in line with like the work of kind of Chris Bale, for instance, looking at Twitter and seeing what happens when we're exposed to political opponents. It's not that we're moderating and coming together. We're actually can become more polarized. And it makes sense when the interaction looks like this, right? Like it's not going to lead to moderation. I've written about this in PNAS 2 years ago, and arguing in a more kind of using more simulation agent-based model, arguing that actually conflict can, like developing the hypothesis that conflict can actually function as a driver of polarization, and that like isolation as the idea of a loop between isolation and radicalization, it's not really in line with the kind of sociological work historically on what drives polarization between groups, that it's much more possible that conflict is the driver, and that we can kind of turn the echo chamber on its head and have a polarization driven by conflictual interaction between the political opponents. So the problem is not, yeah.
We want to go back to the point you made before about that it doesn't really matter whether there's bots there or not, because it doesn't change the experience. But of course, the different platforms might lend itself to be overtaken by bots. You think quite easily of a bot producing tweets, especially conflictual tweets, and even the simplest large language models can produce very conflictual tweets in a very high tempo. So I would think that your percentages, in particular Twitter is so conflictual, that's the platform that I would think would be overrun with bots that are there for, especially the political sphere, to try and influence the politics of countries that consider adversary. So at this point, I think I was absolutely right, but I think that bots do matter.
Yeah.
In this particular context.
Yeah, no, it might be that like maybe 30% or something of Twitter are bots, and that like actually it's again just 50-50 or something. However, I mean, it still doesn't really fall into the notion of an echo chamber. But I think it's always, yeah, we need to be kind of mindful of what we're arguing when we're seeing what's being said on social media, because I think we can often risk thinking of social media as kind of representative of the population, but it's like it's not that different from broadcast media in my perspective. It's just kind of a complex system type of broadcast media where it's like, 1% or 0.5% of users that are posting and are being visible, and most people are just lurking. And so, yeah.
Maybe I'm deviating, but coming back to the bots. And how easy it is nowadays to detect bots? Because 3-4 years ago, people would have algorithms and would filter out what are bots or what are not. But with the LLMs, maybe it's hard.
Yeah, it's very hard. I mean, like, I don't think that the algorithms from 2-3 years ago were that good. Like, it was often just like, did they post more than 500 times in a day? Then it's a bot, like, okay, have they slept in a week? Like that was basically like a common strategy for identifying bots. And it's, I mean, like it was easy to bypass then, and now it's just, yeah. But yeah, it's very difficult, right? Yeah. I would say like the way that people detect if things are bots or not is that bots are a little bit more well articulated and like less toxic. But as we've learned, they can also mean that they're Nazi, right? Like, they're just straight from Stormfront. Yeah. No, so it's very hard, and yeah, and I tend to, because of my kind of perspective, I tend to argue that we're looking at social media and not as kind of representative of people and people interaction, but as a kind of the dynamics of how we, because when we engage and we read social media, that gives us a perception, because we also have the misperception that this is somehow the population interacting, right? Like as individuals. And so by kind of overrepresenting the most toxic and outrageous voices, we get the idea that the political opponents are highly toxic. So it's very much the kind of idea of like this as a trigger bubble, that the platforms, it's not that it's like a filter bubble that's isolating us from political disagreement. It's a trigger bubble that is actively showing the most outrageous and toxic voices from the other side, that tends to highlight the most loudest and the most outrageous messages, because it triggers us to engage with the platform, right? The platforms are in a political economy of data extraction, right? And how do you extract data? Well, by maximizing attention, maximizing engagement, and making you talk about yourself. Like that's how you get your data, right? And so the argument is kind of that the political economy of digital capitalism, of surveillance capitalism, is very much aligned with how you would want to optimize platforms if you also want to polarize communities. And so that it might be more kind of useful to think of this as a kind of trigger bubble rather than a filter bubble. Yeah.
Do we know anything about the Twitter algorithm, if they actively do this or not?
Yeah.
I would expect, I mean, for my political views, but still I get all this kind of racist nonsense that you see on Twitter. So it would sort of imply that they actively.
Yeah. So this is exactly my argument, and yeah, it's we do know that they do this. Like, it is.
Let's say TikTok, or where you only get to see the videos that are very well matched to videos that you already met.
Yeah. There is, I mean, yeah, so it is more complicated, but I think also on TikTok there are people doing this kind of, I mean, rage baiting is the kind of thing on TikTok or Reels, right? Like, so there is some aspect of this, but it doesn't, like, they have, I would say rather that they have a lot of moderation and algorithmic moderation to reduce things that like are political and that are toxic and so on. But you often notice people pronounce words in really absurd ways in TikTok videos, that they say like Einstein instead of Einstein. And why do they do that? Because it triggers people to correct them and write a comment, and then their videos go higher up because there's more engagement. So,
and do you know, is that, for example, for Twitter today, is the algorithm explicitly thinking, I have to show them controversial content so that they stay, or is it just sort of naively optimizing?
Naive optimization, yeah.
Just because it's naively optimizing engagement, it sort of ends up serving.
Yeah. I think, I mean, I in no way think that the people working at these platforms, even the people writing the algorithms, have any idea that this will happen. And I mean, they're also kind of testing to see what, because it's emergent dynamics. This is the entire, like, this is the entire thing, right? And the thing with also emergent dynamics with humans in it is that it's even worse, because we are also trying to like game the system. We're also trying to figure out the algorithm and how to game it. And so then you get people saying Einstein, because it's like, I also like, I need to correct this person. This is very upsetting. It's like, it's the worst thing. But so yeah, no, it's very much not a conscious process, but they're, you know, I think the most useful way of thinking of it is that there's a political economy reason for them trying to optimize engagement, which is that it's what gives them their company value, data extraction and advertising. But so let's try to like draw this together to the promised new paradigm, because this is kind of the two contradictory arguments with the kind of in-group favoritism and this idea that you know, like actually there's a lot of hearts in the messages, and like actually like there's a very intimate community on Stormfront. At the same time, on the other hand, we have this very high level of toxicity on other platforms. And so I think as a kind of replacement of the echo chamber as the kind of metaphor of the last 20 years of thinking of polarization, I really like to go to Muzaffar Sharif's 1954 Robber's Cave experiment, which is so in this experiment, it's like a classic social psychology experiment. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of it. But so basically, it's a summer, it's a warm summer, and Muzaffar Sharif, he says he's going to organize a summer camp. So he recruits 22 fifth grade boys, and he tells them and he tells their parents that it's just going to be a summer camp, because this was the glorious days before ethics and research. And so they were all kind of very homogenous boys. They're all like white, Protestant, middle class. But it's not just a summer camp, because the goal of Muzaffar Sharif is to try to figure out the conditions that lead to group polarization. And an interesting thing, which is often used as a criticism of this experiment, if you read the Mensen Duger, sorry for the pronunciation, Humankind, he's critical of this experiment for this reason, because actually Muzaffar Sharif had to run the experiment twice to actually succeed in getting polarization. But I don't necessarily think that's a counter-argument, because it's like, I think it's interesting. He tried to identify the conditions that led to group polarization. And what he came up with in the second round was that he found that he needed to combine isolation and interaction to create the dynamics of polarization. So in the first weeks, in the isolation weeks, the groups were kept separate. They didn't know of each other's existence, and they were given stuff like flags and stuff to make their own flags, and they made T-shirts. They came up with like group names like the Rattlers and the Eagles. They came up with their own colors. They had like certain people became the leaders. Basically, they developed it's kind of like this intimate community dynamics that we saw in Stormfront, similar kind of dynamics of group formation. And then in the second week, they had the interaction part where it was like competition with tournaments with different sports. So they started interacting, and it led to dynamics of more and more intensified polarization or conflict between the groups. One group, I think the Rattlers, burned the flag of the Eagles. The Eagles like showed up and like raided the house of the Rattlers and so on. And then after a while, like it really turned into fistfights, and Mustafa Sharif had to famously cancel the experiment, in part, which is not always mentioned, because the winners of the tournament were given knives, and like, and so they would show up with knives. I'm like, yeah, this is not a good idea. Like they're stabbing each other. Like, yeah, what do you think would happen? But so he was like, yeah, so we have to cancel this before someone gets stabbed. And I think that this is a much more kind of richer kind of metaphor for understanding what social media does to us, that we have both this kind of isolation, this base for in-group formation, defining norms, putting a flag down, and so on. Because a lot of social media affordances allow us to do that, right? To form community. And then there's a lot of kind of conflictual interaction between the communities, developing kind of negative stereotypes about the other community. And that this is kind of a better metaphor for what social media does. So like looking at the kind of isolation paradigm, we can kind of argue that we have a new kind of identity paradigm or a conflict paradigm, where the dynamics, the feedback loop is between conflict and group belonging rather than isolation and radicalization. Politics is about identity, emotion, group, community, and so on. And polarization is also intergroup conflict related to kind of affective polarization in the political science literature. In terms of theorists, I don't know how interested you are in theorists, but as kind of a sociologist by background, I draw more on kind of Durkheim and his work on kind of community formation with Rowland Collins. Goffman, instead of thinking of social media as kind of rational exchange, is kind of a form of self-presentation through which we write ourselves into being. We develop our identity through interaction. Teifel, Mustafa Sharif, Alport, kind of social psychologists of group identity. And interesting, I think this also has a kind of implication of a kind of methodological shift from just focusing on the structure of interaction to thinking of the content of interaction and drawing on natural language processing, large language models, which allows us to really capture this kind of this more identity-based aspects. So how much time do I have? Because I have more slides, so I can keep going.
There is a mouse. They have a 10 minutes break.
What's your question?
Yeah, I'm just like wondering, have you observed any kind of or measure any kind of latency in polarizations? So perhaps like one type of polarization, it just like strike to the peak, but all of a sudden like within quite a short period of time, just like bursting up, and then like we don't observe any more kind of side effect of it.
Yeah.
Perhaps in some particular configurations of polarizations, you see that kind of like latency, which that it lasts longer. And it brings like another carry-on effect to other type of polarizations.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would definitely, I haven't looked over time yet, because it's like the social media politics data is just like, it's like 2 weeks old. So I haven't really looked so much at it, but I think this thing on temporal dynamics is super interesting. I would also like, since it's kind of, that data concerns parties and stuff, so I would really expect to see that campaigns would have huge effects, right? That there would kind of be shifts prior to elections with rising level of polarization. So yeah, I mean, but I haven't really looked at it so much yet. But I can say a little bit what I've been working on, building on this perspective. So one thing that I've been looking at is kind of, because so far, if we were arguing that intergroup conflict and thinking of this through the lens of identity, I think a next natural step is to try to disentangle and get a better understanding of the process of group formation, and also looking at the kind of leaders, like partisan political leaders of different groups, looking at their communication through the lens of social identity. And so this is stuff I've been working on, in part like through the framework of like, okay, so we have like the term populism in political science and political communication is very much discursively defined, right? Like if someone is a populist or not depends on, it's kind of a type of discourse, type of language. You have a separation between the elite and the people, and the people are homogenous, and the politics should be the will of the people, etc. You know, and this is the argument that maybe we should have a similar kind of perspective on polarization, that we can see we can identify effective polarization and intergroup conflict as a type of language of political elites. And so using LLMs, we're developing a kind of definition drawing on social identity theory of how leaders communicate and trying to apply that to see if that allows us to see effective polarization in language of political elites. And it's ongoing, but it does seem super like that it does capture something about how political elites communicate. And so also trying to untangle the group formation processes in more detail. Yeah.
What would you expect the difference between polarization and populism?
Yeah, I mean, so populism, I think honestly that they're super connected in a lot of ways, but populism is kind of polarization against an imagined elite, right? And it has this sort of, you know, I think in the general understanding would be that effective polarization is between partisan groups. So it's the other party are the out group. So it's basically a Manichean separation between the parties. But I think it's super aligned and entangled with populism. And I ultimately think that like those terms are more are very like quite similar and like in ways that haven't really been highlighted. And that's like also kind of a point of this paper to kind of be like actually like populism kind of maybe misses part of the point when we're talking about it in the political science terms. That it has a lot of it is rather a question of polarization entangled with a kind of political shift to with new cleavages opening up and a kind of political realignments. And so the other part of my ongoing work is like, okay, so the question, what do we do about it? So the kind of question, how can we, because we did see that there is some level of rational deliberation and that some platforms are like kind of better than others. So this also begs the question of like, but okay, so how do we create platforms that encourage rational deliberation? Of course, that's kind of a space where using observational data collected from platforms give us very little. I mean, we can't really imagine how things would be different based on observational data, right? We need simulations, we need modeling. And so I recently was awarded a VD project to do that, which is based on this preprint that I'll mention here. So basically it's the idea of using large language models to simulate social media platforms. So we create it's combining agent-based modeling and large language models. And so basically we build a social media platform populated with large language models that are interacting and then make changes to the platform and see how that changes the dynamics of conversation and whether we can create and encourage kind of rational deliberation. So how do we do that? So this is kind of a sketch of the platform. So basically use ANES data, so American National Election Survey, which has like very detailed information about American voters. Including like, you know, what hobbies they have, what news they read, etc. And so we take that and take a sample of the US population and turn it into kind of a persona for an LLM. So it's like, you're male, you're middle income, you're 45 years old, evangelical Protestant from Iowa, blah, blah, blah. You like hunting, fishing, and woodworking. So this comes from the survey data and it's a representative part of the population. We create a lot of these personas and populate the platform with them. And then we're simulating a specific day, just 2 days after the model training data period. And since I know what newspaper they read, so I get all the news from that day. And I show them the news from the news, like a sample of news articles from the day from the specific day that I know that they read, these individuals. And then they can decide if they want to post about this on their social media platform. And so they pick an article and they post it with like a comment. And then there's a timeline algorithm that allows the other users to see those posts, comment upon them, like them, share them, whatever. And there's the model is running with them, interacting and sharing and so on. And so what we're interested in is like changing the timeline algorithm to different algorithms. What can we do to encourage useful rational deliberation? So he's looking at like the interaction. Yeah, it produces fairly realistic kind of, yeah.
How do they decide where to comment or to post?
That's up to the LLM based on their persona. So it's basically this is your persona, and like you're on this platform, you see this timeline. What do you do? Like, do you want to comment or something? Do you want to like something? And then they do that and interact with the content.
No, it's stochastic, like based on what you feed from the statistics of the population, that person has a likelihood to.
Yeah, so I know how often they use social media and how often they post, because it's in the ANES data. So that's also part of the kind of properties of the agents. And so they're sampled on the likelihood that they would post, basically. Which is highly uneven, it's highly correlated with being political and so on.
So some agents never post it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
So it's wasting.
basically most never post. Used to.
I mean, you run this on your laptop or is
Yeah. But so I was using, like, if I use with Llama 3.2, I can run it on my laptop. It's just gonna take a while, a long while. So I ran this one. I ran with 500 agents, but ultimately it doesn't really because to some degree I can just sample from the US population every time. You just give them a new name, and then it's like infinite, right? So the question is what you mean by that. It just becomes a question of how long you run it, because it's like the time scale question with agent-based models is always a bit I don't know, arbitrary. But I run it's like 6 hours.
When you say you resample from the population, I mean, that's a different run, right? So you follow is the population actually turning over?
Yeah, no, so in the way I ran this, so what I mean is like it's like 500 users that I have, and then they're in a network, they're interacting. But basically the difference between having infinite users, it would just be that I can, every time I get a user, instead of sampling from the population I created, I can just sample and get an entirely new user with a new name and a new identity. And then that it will be an infinite. Yeah, it's just always with agent-based modeling, it's kind of, time and scale is kind of made up. So
There's some natural way to embed them in the already existing network.
yeah, so exactly. So that this is kind of a tricky thing, right? That they don't have a past, like it would be interesting to be like, run a 5-year simulation and like capture their childhood and stuff, but need a bigger laptop.
Create the characters that are loyal to the US statistics that I see, but how do you jump to make them in the network? How to connect them?
Yeah. So I have different. So I'll get to this, but I have kind of one network which is the kind of echo chamber network where they actually have friends and stuff. So there I'm taking the agents and then I'm using information about them to generate a social network with who they have as friends, which is a highly kind of echo chamber network in that they're more likely to be friends with people from their own political side. But I mean, ideally, that is also something I'm working also on a paper where the network of friendships also emerges through the LLMs, that they choose who they're friends with. Maybe there's like people you might know button, and like how does that change the emergence of the network? But yeah, I mean, ultimately, this stuff, it gets very complicated if you want to capture everything. And my approach to ABMs is that I generally try to keep it simple. Was there a hand there?
Yeah, I don't agree with your comment on ABMs that the time and space you cannot align.
Yeah.
Because you can and you should, I think, for a more validated model. And it's also in your data, right? You mentioned to know how often they comment.
Yeah, no, so I do this, so I do this and I align it, so it's 6 hours and I capture, I do align this. It is just that like ultimately I do that based on how often they post and how often an individual, because I know how often they interact and so on. But it's just that the difference, I don't know, to a certain degree, we can argue more about this, but there's like where you draw the boundary around things and like you can have different definitions and ultimately there is a kind of arbitrariness in this definition, right? So it's not like there's not a movement of time in the simulation that I can like align with the movement of time. It's more that like this amount of event usually happens within 6 hours. So I need to align that it's 6 hours and 6 hours. Yeah.
No, I do agree. Lots of agent-based models don't do it at all, but you have the opportunity or more of the opportunity.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, and this can be made quite like realistic to certain degrees. But so what do I actually look at in this in the simulation experiment? So there's this idea of a bridging algorithm that I'm interested in. So the bridging algorithm is this like idea that we can incentivize messages that cut across the political divide that are kind of either cross-cutting or that allows us to ally with someone from the other side. And so this is Chris Bale, who's co-author on the paper, wrote this. So basically incentivizing content that cuts across political divides. And so I'm comparing 3 different platforms that capture.
We should stop now.
Oh, so should I jump straight to the conclusion? And so we look echo chambers, we look more conflictual interaction. We find looking at toxicity and interaction across the partisan divide. Echo chambers are friendly, but they're echo chambers. Engagement algorithms are toxic, but they're not echo chambers. The bridging algorithm leads to friendly interaction across the partisan divide. There's a lot of kind of focus on issues that are cross-cutting, like cultural things that are popular among both parties and that create a kind of unifying effect. Promising dynamics, we still need to, I mean, I have a VD project, so there's still things left to do, luckily, for the next 5 years. Yeah, so thank you. These are some of the papers mentioned.
Yeah. So how do you test that this type of simulated social media actually represents anything that's real, like it seems that you're testing on some imagined platform then and not really cross-checking that it's.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I think I'm kind of conflicted about this in certain ways because my approach to agent-based modeling and through simulation is always kind of a toy model approach. Like we have very simple models, try to capture simple emergent mechanisms that we can generalize and like it's we can believe in it because it's so general. I mean, like the Schelling segregation model. I don't know. I mean, if you do anything involving a grid, it always turns up. Like, and so it's important because it's so resilient. And so I think what for me makes these models useful is when they identify an emergent mechanism that is highly rigorous and applies across context and that we can use in telling social scientific story. That's like kind of my thinking about this. Of course, that shapes a little bit with the fact that large language models are not that simple and that it's kind of things going on inside of the models that can be very hard to identify. But I think that there's still like, I think why this is interesting is that it enables us to study emergent dynamics in culture, which is just hasn't really been done in the way that the models are kind of observing things and adapting to it in ways that traditional agent-based models just can't do, and which I think is just central to like the ontological nature of emergence in the social world. I think I've written a lot about this, but natural and social emergence are different things, and we haven't had tools to study social emergence.
There's sort of a problem I see if you're trying to create a social media that allows for sort of cross-bubble civil discussion. Maybe that it's very easy to enforce that if you don't allow people to talk about politics or religion or stuff like that. You have a small talk social media.
Yeah.
But people won't enjoy interacting. There's sort of another dimension which you have to maximize, maybe engagement.
Yeah.
Right. I guess that's the question. Can you maximize engagement while preserving
Yeah.
Non-echo chain.
Yeah, I mean, so this is also something that we're like doing in the VD project to actually extend, also look at the amount of, but I mean, we don't have to imagine this, right? Because ultimately, like Facebook, Instagram, they've very actively tried to push, in like TikTok, very actively try to disencourage people to talk about politics, because it creates a bad vibe. I mean, there's different things to say about that. I think it's, of course, extremely problematic if in our public sphere we don't talk about politics, but it can also be depolarizing to talk about things that are not polarizing.
I was also impressed about the generalization of what you propose in the video, like, because you mathematically you're optimizing a social media to control 4 parameters, so you could do it for anything. So
yeah,
how do you see that possible or not? Like you could optimize like thing that could optimize anything. If you see the other way around, not to control use of polarization. How do you see it?
yeah. I mean, so I agree, and like I'm looking at like cooperation for on reducing kind of teenage anxiety and the entire, the anxious generation framing of like, can we simulate social media to make them less horrible places for young people? Like that's another example of something that I think is interesting to look at. But yeah, I mean, yeah, for sure. I think it's interesting to in some ways just like take responsibility for the type of social spaces that we're producing through our technology, which I think we aren't, and is being able to measure and get a better understanding of what different affordances does to social and political life, I think is crucial.
Did you look at differences in things like the in-group favoritism, the out-group derogation, and the critical thinking or critical discourse? Did you see differences between the political spectrum? Is it the same for left-leaning and right-leaning parties, or do you see study any of those things?
So there are differences. It's a little bit tricky because I'm looking actually not at the committing party, but the party that is exposed to it, right? Like I have information about the receiving end of the toxicity. And so I do find that like, so left, right on economic issues doesn't really make a difference. But if you're pro-immigration, you're going to be more, if you're pro-multicultural, you're going to be more exposed to toxicity. I also classified all the commenters on whether they're right of the party or left of the party. And the right is worse, but there's not a huge difference. It's like a tiny difference, like 3% or something, 5%. But yeah, I'm still kind of looking at this. It's also tricky because, I don't know, things like left, right, if you look at 208 countries, like it doesn't make sense, like left, right in Russia is just different from left, right in Europe and so on. So it's different alignments. Yeah, so I think I need to look at OECD countries or so on. All right, I guess I've held everyone too long already. Thank you.